Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to learn a little bit from me today. My name is Trent Hanthorn. I'm with Centier Bank. I've been with Centier for about almost 5 years now. I'll tell you a little bit about Centier before I get started, just to give you a little bit of background. Centier is actually Indiana's largest family-owned private bank. We've been around for 125 years last year, which was super exciting for us. Obviously, things were a little bit strange. With our 125th anniversary, we had a big celebration scheduled. I had to rearrange some things, but still owned by the same family that started us 125 years ago. We're in the 4th generation now. The 5th generation's on board, and we'll be taking over at some point in the future. So if you ever see our advertisements, they're always going to say "not for sale," and that's our owner's promise to us, the family's promise to us, and that's our promise to the folks that we help, is that we aren't going to sell to a big bank. We're going to continue to be family owned and operate that way. So today I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about savings. Savings can be a really difficult thing to do. It's really simple to think about and to tell yourself how to do it, but actually putting it into practice is a little more difficult. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about maybe some different ways to think about savings, different ways to go about putting together your savings plan, so that hopefully you can make your savings a little more successful. The way I'm going to do it is I'm going to break it down into 5 easy steps for anybody to take. Whether you have a smaller budget for savings or you have more that you want to put aside for savings, these steps will help in any situation. So we'll go ahead and get started with our 5 steps. The first step, I think, is a really easy one to do, but it's something that a lot of people don't think about. And that's to start with actual goals for your savings. So a lot of people will say, well, I'm going to put $25 every paycheck into a savings account. When you ask them why they're doing that, they say, oh, because I feel like I should have a savings account. That's good, but I don't think it's the best way to go about setting up your savings plan. I think having actual goals in mind to set up your savings plan is the best way to go about making them successful. So I think the biggest thing is to make actual goals you want to save towards. Think about what you want to save towards. Take a minute to write down those items that you feel are important to you to save for. And I think that's the other key, is what's important to you. What's important to one person might not be important to another person when it comes to saving. So I'll go through a little list of some popular savings items, but it can be anything you want. So one of the biggest ones we see is an emergency fund. People always like to have that emergency fund just for when the unexpected happens, right? So whether you have an appliance that breaks, or your roof starts leaking, your car breaks down and needs fixed. Those are all things that it's good to have that emergency fund sitting there for. What I'll tell you is the recommendation for emergency fund is to have 6 months of your annual salary set aside in an emergency fund. That's a very difficult thing to do. Am I saying that I think within the next year you should have 6 months of your savings set aside? Absolutely not. I think it's up to you to decide how much you think is feasible to put aside for an emergency fund, or to put aside for any of these other things, and to figure out how to get to that point. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. Education is another big one that people like to save for. Whether you're saving for your kids to go to college, you're saving for yourself to go to college, or to get some sort of continuing education, those are also really important things to save for. There are lots of great savings products out there specifically for savings that I would recommend you talk to a financial advisor about if that's something that you're interested in. Obviously, another thing to save for is some sort of major purchase. Maybe you plan on buying a house in a few years. You know that your car is going to need replaced within the next few years. You have a big home improvement project that you know is coming up. Those are also super important things to save for a lot of people. Maybe you have a wedding coming up for yourself, for a kid, for a grandchild. There's all kinds of things to save for when it comes to a wedding. One that a lot of people like to put on their priorities list is a vacation. A lot of people think vacations are hard to do, and they don't have that plan set aside. So I think if you want to take a vacation, great. I think that's super important for you to take the time to yourself, to go enjoy yourself, get away from the real world, and enjoy some time with your family. As long as you can do it correctly. Another one that people really like to save for is retirement. Whether you are saving yourself for retirement, something like an IRA, putting money aside in a 401k with your employer, there's all kinds of different ways to save for retirement as well. I think the key there is to start early and to save what you can. Lots of employers will offer some sort of match into your 401k. I would always recommend people to at least take advantage of the match that their employer offers. So if you have an employer that's going to offer you, if you put aside 6% of your salary, they'll put aside 3% of your salary for you. I would always recommend that you take advantage of that. I can't tell you another savings account that's going to guarantee you a 50% return right off the bat. So take advantage of that if it's a possibility. So after you come up with your priorities to save and you've written them down, I want you to go ahead and rank them. 1, 2, 3. What's the most important? Is an emergency fund the most important thing for you? Vacations number 2. Whatever it is, write down what your priorities are. I think a key in this is to actually write these items down. I think that's very important because it just helps you hold yourself accountable to making sure that these things happen. Step number 2 is to focus on why those items are important to you. This is another one that I think a lot of people miss. I think a lot of people say, I need to save for an emergency fund, but they don't say why that's so important, and that makes it much harder for them to actually do, to put that money aside for savings. Saving for an emergency fund can help you avoid future debt. It can make sure that if something happens and you've got that money set aside for an emergency fund, you're not putting money on a credit card. You're not doing something else to make it so that you can pay for those emergencies. If you're saving for a family vacation, you get to spend more time with your family. You get to enjoy something outside, get a little fresh air, which obviously in today's world is very, very important. If you're saving for retirement, why is that important? Because you don't want to work until you're 95. You want to work until you're able to retire, and saving for retirement is going to make that a possibility. So I think really figuring out why those things are so important to yourself and telling yourself why they're important to make sure that you continue doing those, right? So after you make those your priority throughout this whole thing, it obviously takes a little bit of discipline to do this savings. But that's why I think it's important to tell yourself why it's so important to you, because that makes that discipline a little bit easier. So step 3 is to figure out how much you're going to save, right? So I said at the beginning, 6 months annual salary for your emergency fund. Let's start with a more reasonable number. Let's say you want to have $1,200 set aside 1 year from now for an emergency fund. And let's say you also want to take a vacation in 6 months. Since it's January, you're going to take a vacation this summer. Figure out how much you want to have saved for those. Let's say you're going to have $1,200 saved for an emergency fund and $600 saved for some sort of vacation. So the next step is to figure out how much you need to save, how often. I think the easiest way to do this is figure out how often you get paid. So if you get paid once a month and you want to have in 12 months, $1,200 saved for your emergency fund, the math's pretty simple. You're going to put $100 aside every paycheck into that savings account. At the end of 12 months, you're going to have your $1,200 emergency fund. If you want to have $600 saved in 6 months, same thing. You're going to put $100. If you get paid every 2 weeks, figure out how many times you get paid between now, the time you make your priority, and the time you're going to take that vacation for $600. Figure out how much of each of those paychecks is going to have to go into that savings account. And that will make saving for that much, much more realistic. When you just throw a big number into your head, a lot of times it can seem overwhelming. I think so much of financial wellness is in your mind. And I think just being able to break it down into those much smaller, more doable chunks makes things a little bit easier to do. A couple more recommendations on these. A lot of people will have one savings account and they're going to say, here's where I'm going to put all of my savings, and I'm going to save for an emergency fund and I'm going to save for that vacation in the savings account. That's one way to do it. That's fine. It's not what I would recommend. And the reason is, if let's say you want to save that $600 for your vacation, $1,200 for your emergency fund, in 4 months, let's say you've got a $300 vehicle repair that needs to happen. In 3 months, you're going to have $600 put away in your savings account, right? Because you put $100 in there each month for the vacation, you put $100 in there each month for your emergency fund. So you've got $300 in your emergency fund. The way I feel is if I go into that one savings account and I pull the $300 out for my vehicle, I feel like I just took away from both of my priorities. I feel like I took away from my vacation fund and I took away from my emergency fund, which is obviously where I meant to take it from. So that's why I always recommend having savings accounts for each of those priorities. Have an emergency fund account, have a vacation fund account, and that will help you just in your mind, not feel like you're taking away from the wrong thing. Is that going to stop you from hitting your 1,200 at the end of 12 months? Yes, but you used it for the right thing, right? It's not going to stop you from getting your 600 for your vacation fund. And you used that emergency fund for exactly what you prioritized. So that's why I always recommend having those set aside. The other things is I always recommend making it as easy as possible for yourself to put that money aside. Whether you can go to your employer and say, I want to put my paycheck in my checking account, other than I want to put $100 in this savings account and $100 in this savings account. If your employer can do that straight from your check, perfect. That means you don't have to think about it. If your employer can't do that, you can go to your bank. And in your bank, you can say, hey, every time I get paid every Friday, I want you to automatically transfer $100 to this savings account and another $100 to this savings account. And again, that's something that you then don't have to think about. I run across people all the time. They come to my office and they say, I want to open a checking account and a savings account. And I'm just going to come in every 2 days or every 2 weeks when I get paid to put money in that savings account. And I bet you can't guess how many people actually do that. It's almost zero. And I tell them right up front, most people aren't able to do that for themselves. They're not able to convince themselves when it comes down to it to put that money in that savings account. So I think making it as easy and little work on you as possible, very important. Lastly, I think it's important to make that money as invisible as possible. So if you use online banking, everybody uses online banking nowadays. I think it's important to go into your online banking and see if you can hide those accounts so you can't see them. That does a couple things. The main one is that it stops you from logging into your online banking and thinking, man, I would really like to have this pair of shoes. I've wanted them, they're on sale now. I can't afford them out of my checking account. But look, I see that I've got $200 in my emergency fund. I could just use that for that pair of shoes. Remember, at the beginning, you set your priorities, and one of those priorities was not that pair of shoes. If you make that account invisible when you log into your online banking, out of sight, out of mind, right? So you're not going to look at it and think, I have this $200 that I can spend. You're still going to be working towards your priorities. So I think that is another good key to helping save for that. So number 4 is decide when and how much to save, and that's kind of what we just talked about. So you're going to set those aside, you're going to transfer that money with no work to yourself to get that money put into those savings accounts. You're going to put the $100 for your vacation fund, you're going to put the $100 for your emergency fund, and you're going to hide them to make it so that you don't have to do that yourself, just to make things much easier on you. The 5th step, I think, is the best step personally for myself, especially with the emergency fund. A lot of times you're going to want to do something else, right? You're going to want to grow that further. You get to the end of that 12 months, you got $1,200. You say, okay, in another 12 months, I want to have another $1,200, 24 months, right? Or $2,400 total, right? But I think with those other things, so you saved for a vacation, right? We said the vacation for $600 is your priority at the end of those 6 months. When you get to the end of those 6 months, celebrate, take a vacation, right? You saved up that money because that's what you said your priority is. So I think doing those things is super important. It's very easy to get to the end of that 6 months and think, I'd really like to take $1,000 vacation in another 4 months. And I did it, but you picked the vacation you wanted. You knew it was going to cost you $600. You saved the $600. Take that vacation. You owe it to yourself to make sure you do that. And then you can move on to other priorities. Maybe you say, okay, now I don't need to take another vacation for a year, so I'll save up a little bit more, take a little bit bigger vacation. Or now I'm going to save up for those shoes that I wanted to buy a couple months ago that I didn't end up buying because I had the money in the right place. So I think celebrating those successes in anything that you're doing financially is super important. A couple other things specifically around the emergency fund I would recommend, but you can do it for whatever you want. If you get a little bit of extra money, put that towards that savings goal as well. If you get a stimulus check and you can put a little bit of that aside, put it into that savings account for your emergency fund. And that's going to help you reach that goal faster. If you reach that goal faster, then you can move on to something else more quickly, right? So that'll help you save for those other items that you wanted to get, the new shoes or whatever else that is, a higher emergency fund, whatever it is. So I think taking the little bit extras that you get a bonus at work, whatever it is, little bit extras, and putting those aside. The last thing I'll say is I think it's very important to revisit these periodically. If your goal right now is a vacation and you get to the end of that vacation, figure out what else you want to do. Don't just let that $100 sit idle. Figure out your next goal so you can move on to the next thing that you want to accomplish. You should always be saving towards some sort of goal, even if it is, okay, now I'm just going to put it all into my emergency fund. That's fine. As long as you have your priority and you set it for yourself, you know what's important to you, and that's going to help you reach your goals more quickly. So that is my top 5 tips on savings. Again, I'm Trent Hanthorn with Centier Bank. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to what I have to say today.